Vienna, capital of Austria, is a city that has always sparked my imagination and my memories since I was a student there many years ago. I let my thoughts drift back to mellow gray-stone buildings peeking softly out of snowstorms in the winter's night, roaring fires, Strauss waltzes, Viennese coffee mit Schlag. They all come rushing to my mind. And the food, spectacular desserts, beautiful pork roasts with prunes and mysterious spices, and Gulyas pungent with paprika, tender beef with peppers and onions crowned with sour cream. Vienna was influenced heavily from 4 directions. The Latin countries of the south contributed music and dancing, the famed Viennese waltz, and grapevines producing wines of strength like bull's blood or the meltingly rich Tokais. The immediate east was tantalizing with her gypsies, colorful and passionate. They were the alter ego of many of the staid Austrian citizens. The Magyar culture flourished and produced the finest flour available and the mild, sweet red pepper known as paprika. Further east was Turkey, just across the Bosphorus, with her coffee and all the fruits of the Orient. And then the Crusaders moved through Vienna, bringing anise, saffron, and a Christianized culture. So Vienna was drawn in many directions, and fortunately for us, her cuisine reflects all of them. Vienna is a city apart, much older than the Austria that surrounds her, and I think her foods reflect all those centuries of influence. Austria, Hungary, Turkey, and the Latin South. The remnants of the influential Habsburg Empire all brought together in the meals in Vienna. So now let's sample the foods of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Appetizers always give us the first clue to any cuisine. The Hungarians and the Austrians are blessed with rich farmlands and majestic forests. Farmlands bring eggs, wheat, and a large variety of vegetables to my mind, and forests always suggest game to me, but most of all, forests mean mushrooms. I love mushrooms. They are so delicate, so light, so close to being nothing, but so emphatically something. I think perhaps they're an acquired taste. Well, I acquired it young. They are subtle and tend to be wasted on coarse palates. So, as an ultimate compliment to our guests, we presume they are sophisticated enough to appreciate our pickled mushrooms. First, we must choose the mushrooms. Now, fresh mushrooms are imperative. And I hear you ask, Mr. Price, how do I know if my mushrooms are fresh or old? Well, it's extremely simple. Find the mushroom bin in the supermarket. Now, turn every mushroom you pick upside down. The underside of the cap of the mushroom should be smooth and not opened into gills. Then we know that the mushroom is fresh. For pickling, I try to choose smaller mushrooms because they are easier for my guests to handle. If I cannot find small ones, I use only the caps of the larger mushrooms. Now, I take 1 pound of mushrooms and I wash them. Now, I can't imagine standing at the sink with a tiny brush in hand scrubbing each little mushroom. So there's an easier way to wash mushrooms. Put the mushrooms in a good-sized plastic bag. Yes, plastic bag. Add about 2 cups of water, twist the bag shut, and shake it violently over the sink till the water is dirty brown. Now dump your mushrooms into a colander and rinse them, and, well, voila, you have clean mushrooms. Before we go any further at all, December mushrooms are incredibly delicate and deserve the finest herbs and spices money can buy. Don't fool yourself. Freshness, quality, and integrity are everything in creating things with spices. Now, I put my cleaned mushrooms in a large bowl and pour in a cup of white wine and a cup of wine vinegar. I cover the bowl and refrigerate it for at least an hour or more, even overnight. And then I drain the mushrooms, reserve the wine and vinegar to make a superb salad dressing used in place of plain vinegar. And then you toss your mushrooms with 2 tablespoons full of chopped parsley, 2 teaspoons of chives or green onions, and 2 or 3 dashes of ground cloves and a minced clove of garlic. Then add a teaspoonful each of salt and granulated pepper and 2 or 3 generous dashes of Tabasco sauce and toss again. Pack the mushrooms tightly into jars or a crock with a lid and drizzle them with a cup of olive oil or just enough to barely cover them. Add a bay leaf to the jar or crock and close the lid. The mushrooms should stand for 2 days at least. I serve them on a platter covered with greens, piercing each mushroom with a toothpick, and I surround the mushrooms with Viennese stuffed eggs for a lovely hors d'oeuvre course. The stuffed eggs are simplicity themselves to prepare. First, we hard boil 6 eggs. Choose the 6 eggs. If you have any doubts about their freshness, slip them into a bowl of water. A fresh egg will sink and a stale one will rise. Slip the eggs into boiling water and then lower the temperature and let the eggs simmer just under the boiling point for 30 minutes. Then rinse them in cold water, peel them, and then we can proceed. Now, split the eggs lengthwise and remove the yolks. I then mash the yolks with 2 tablespoons of mayonnaise, 1 teaspoon of mustard. When this is smooth, I mix in 4 tablespoons of finely chopped cooked ham, 1 tablespoon of minced gherkins, and 1 teaspoon of spiced salt. I then mound the filling into the whites and garnish them with paprika and little diamonds of ham. These look beautiful surrounding the mushrooms. The colors as well as the flavors provide an interesting set of contrasts. I like to serve a medium white wine with these. A Chenin Blanc is lovely, or a Fumé Blanc. I always chill it for several hours, and it fairly sparkles on the tongue with the appetizers. If the weather suggests a hot appetizer, we can have Paliscenta. This is a marvelous Hungarian delight, based on pancakes, very much like crepes. They can, in fact, be prepared with an electric crepe maker. I myself use dip and flip for ease in preparation. First, we must make a batter. Break 4 eggs in your blender and add 1 cup each of whole milk and flour. I then toss in a half a teaspoon of salt and pepper and a half teaspoon of nutmeg. The nutmeg gives the Paliscenta an intriguing and mysterious flavor. Oh, by the way, in shopping, please be certain of the quality and freshness of your spices, for without careful shopping, you will have no flavor at all. Then, after this is all done, I turn the blender on and off several times, scraping down the sides while it's off, until the batter is completely smooth. Now, the batter should be made at least an hour ahead so that the flour can relax and the gluten can form. Gluten is the name for the elastic bands of protein that flour forms and that holds things like our pancakes together. So we make our little thin pancakes, dipping the heated cooking surface into the batter and then cooking the batter for 45 to 60 seconds. I then stack the pancakes with wax paper until all of them are cooked. The Palicentas then are filled and restacked. Now, next, the filling. I open 2 cans of deviled ham, pour them into a bowl, and add 1 egg and 1/4 cup minced onion, plus 1/2 a teaspoon of nutmeg. I then spread each pancake with this, plus 1/2 a tablespoon of sour cream and stack them on an oven-proof plate. Now, we either bake them immediately or they can be wrapped, refrigerated, and baked later. Brush the Paliscenta heavily with 1 cube of melted butter and bake it for 35 minutes at 350 degrees. I usually brush the Paliscenta several more times with the melted butter while it's baking. That way the edges don't dry out. And I garnish this all very simply. I spread the top pancake with sour cream and sprinkle it with paprika. Cut the Paliscenta in wedges just like a cake and serve it piping hot. I even heat the little plates I serve it on. Paliscenta is lovely with a Chenin Blanc also. And this dish spells hospitality, particularly on a cold, blustery night. The hot food and cool wine creates magic that turns a dinner party into a real occasion. A salad can be served in many ways and places throughout the meal. In California, I often see it used as the appetizer itself. In France, it follows the main course as a refresher for the palate. In other countries, it is served with the meal itself. When I make a menu, I try to keep in mind contrasts of color, texture, and flavors. If everything on our plate looked the same, even if it tasted differently, it seems to me it would be a very dull meal. I choose our salad for a contrast in textures as well as a color contrast for our menu. We are having a pork roast with prunes, which is rich and dark. Barley braised with mushrooms, peppers, and onions, hearty and filling, plus piquant red cabbage. Now, I felt the perfect contrast for this in flavor as well as texture and color would be something fresh and crunchy and slightly tart to offset the richness. So, casting about my memories of food in Austria and Hungary, I remember a lovely, refreshing salad based on cucumbers served at a small inn in the southern Austrian countryside. It was far enough south and east so that the Latin and Magyar influences were present, and the cucumbers were dressed with yogurt rather than the sour cream so prevalent in the north. Well, that's a blessing for calorie counters. Yogurt, if used imaginatively, can be as richly rewarding as sour cream and far kinder to the waistline. Now, what we need is 3 or 4 good-sized cucumbers. When I shop for cucumbers, I pick them up and I squeeze them slightly. If the cucumber is soft, I toss it back. We want only firm, crisp cucumbers, not old, mushy ones. I always peel my cucumbers because they are treated with wax sometimes to keep them fresh, and I would really rather not eat the wax. The cucumbers should be sliced thinly. They will be much easier to slice after they are peeled. Now, I certainly don't want to chase a thick chunk of cucumber about my plate trying to cut it, so please be careful to slice them nicely. I then proceed to lightly salt the peeled and sliced cucumbers and allow them to drain out their excess water for about 30 minutes on paper towels. This step allows the cucumbers to soak up much more of the flavorful dressing that is to come. Now, after they have drained, I sprinkle them with 1/4 cup of white wine and red wine vinegar and refrigerate them in a glass bowl. At serving time, I drain them and toss them with 3/4 teaspoonful of chopped parsley and minced onion and serve them in an elegant chilled bowl. I pass a separate dish with a sinfully easy dressing in it. Now, for the dressing, I mix 1 carton of plain yogurt with 2 tablespoons of lemon juice and sugar, and 1 teaspoon of grated lemon peel, 1 teaspoonful of salt and pepper, a dash of Tabasco, and 2 tablespoons full of chopped parsley. This can be made ahead of time and refrigerated until serving time. If you feel you must have a richer dressing, you can stir in 2 tablespoonsful of mayonnaise, but I myself prefer the lightness of yogurt and lemon. This salad provides a delicate note in a very substantial meal. For our vegetable, I choose red cabbage. It's a traditional accompaniment for the pork and a wonderful dish for anyone's repertoire. Try it with a simple roasted chicken sometime. It's really delightful. I generally add apples to my cabbage because the flavor seems to work so well together. To buy a nice cabbage, look for a heavy, brightly colored one. I core and shred my cabbage and then soak it in cold water for about 30 minutes and drain it thoroughly. This seems to leach out any strong flavors and helps the red cabbage retain its lovely color. I saute a half a cup of chopped onion and 3 tablespoonsful of melted butter for about 4 minutes. And then I add the cabbage and cover it and let it simmer for 10 minutes. While it's simmering, I core 2 apples and slice them into thin wedges. I add them to the cabbage with 1/4 cup of boiling water. Cover it and let it simmer on low heat for about 30 minutes. About 10 minutes before serving time, I gently stir in a half cup of red wine and half a cup of brown sugar and 1 tablespoonful of butter. I let this simmer just long enough to blend the flavors, and then I serve it. This always seems to bring back memories of childhood dinners at Grandma's house for some of my guests. They're so appreciative, and I myself am appreciative of the delicious contrast the cabbage is in flavor as well as its rich ruby color. For our entree, I have chosen either roast pork with prunes or a traditional Gulyas. Now, either choice makes a lovely meal. I find the roast more appropriate for special dinners and the slow-cooked Gulyas perfect for family times. However, I would never be shy about serving a Gulyas to my most snobbish guests. The long-cooked rich flavors are nothing at all to be ashamed of, but can be served with pride. First, the roast pork. Now, I choose a boneless roast because they are much easier to carve in front of my guests. My favorite is a boneless pork sirloin. For 6 guests, I would buy a 5 to 6 pound roast. The leftovers make superb sandwiches, and I love a good pork sandwich. I rub my roast with 2 teaspoons of spiced salt and granulated pepper, and I roast it first uncovered in a roasting pan with a lid for 20 minutes at 475 degrees. When the fat is browned, I take the roast from the oven and lift it out of the roasting pan. I take 1 pound of pitted prunes and 2 onions peeled and cut into 8ths and stir them into the pan drippings with a cup of red wine. Then I set the pork back in the pan on the bed of prunes and onions. I toss in 2 or 3 cloves and a bay leaf, and I cover it tightly. The pork should roast 30 minutes per pound of meat, so for our 5-pound roast, it would take about 2.5 hours. Let me tell you, the smell of this roasting should drive the most complacent family wild with desire. Somehow, the kitchen starts to smell like some wonderful magic is taking place, and believe me, it is. Your reputation as a cook should take off from here. I always carve this roast at the table and surround it with the prunes and the onion pieces. It makes a beautiful presentation and is quite easy to carve. The prunes taste divine. Even prune haters will love them. Sit back and enjoy the compliments. A full-bodied white wine is lovely with the pork roast. The Chenin Blanc could be continued, or a white Burgundy would be superb. Try it. Gulyas, which most of you know as goulash, is virtually the national dish of Hungary. There are probably as many variations as there are housewives. This, of course, leaves us a great deal of latitude for authenticity, but I feel that my recipe is the best I've ever eaten. I first buy 2 pounds of good stewing meat, or if chuck or T-bone roasts are cheap, I buy 3 pounds of roast and take it home and with a good sharp knife create my own lean stewing beef. When I have my beef ready, I sprinkle it with 2 teaspoons of meat tenderizer, and I heat 3 tablespoons of oil in a large frying pan, ideally electric, and brown my meat completely. This takes about 8 to 10 minutes. We then pull out the beef and place it in a bowl. Now melt 6 tablespoons of butter in a frying pan and stir in 2 chopped large onions and 1 chopped green pepper and cook them till the onion is golden, tinged with brown. I then stir in 4 tablespoons of good, fresh, red Hungarian, not Spanish, paprika, and I cook it, stirring constantly for 3 minutes. Toss in the beef and stir in 1 cup of beer. Put the lid on tight and cook at 250 degrees for about 2.5 to 3 hours. Stir in 1 cup of sour cream and do not allow the gulyas to boil. The sour cream, onions, peppers, and beer make a lovely sauce. The meat will be as tender as a woman's heart, and the flavor can only be described as reckless, fit for a Habsburg king. I often serve beer as the beverage with my gulyas. Everyone is pleasantly surprised at the delicious combination. Now, my favorite side dish for the pork roast or the gulyas is a little used grain, barley. Sometimes barley gets thrown in homemade soup, but other than that, it's rarely used at all. I think it should be brought out of the pantry and put into the spotlight. Barley has a rich, nutty flavor and a delightful, tender, chewy texture. It couples beautifully with mushrooms to provide a savory accompaniment to many dishes. The Hungarian name is Cerny Kuba. In a good-sized oven-proof covered saucepan or baking dish, melt 1 cube of butter and add 1.5 cups of barley. Cook and stir it for 3 or 4 minutes over low heat. I then pour in 4.5 cups of boiling water and about 1 teaspoonful of salt. Cover this tightly and bake it for 1.5 hours at 350 degrees. This is ideal because it can share an oven with the roast, saving energy. An hour or more before serving time, I saute 1.5 cups of sliced mushrooms in 4 tablespoons of melted butter. When the mushrooms are soft, I add 2 tablespoons of chopped parsley, 2 minced cloves of garlic, a pinch of oregano, and a teaspoon of grated lemon peel. I stir this into the baking pan of barley and add 1/2 cup of white wine to keep it from drying out. I then cover it and slip it back into the oven until it's time for the main course. The barley is a real attention-getter. Most people haven't eaten it and are more than pleasantly surprised, and what a sneaky way to slip vitamins and roughage into everyone's diet. If you serve this with the gulyas, the juices are marvelous, served over the Cerny Kuba. If it's served with the roast pork, I always have butter and sour cream on the table to dress it. An Austro-Hungarian meal is not complete without a reckless, outrageous dessert. The Viennese are known around the world for their famous pastries and their coffee. I let my guests rest for a while after the meal before the dessert. Or sometime after a night at the theater, it's the perfect top to the evening with lots of Viennese-style coffee and a roaring fire. The dessert we are dealing with is a Punsch Torte, or punch cake, a colorful ending to a beautiful meal or a delight by itself. I use a cake mix for this dessert. I consider it a more than legitimate shortcut. We all have much better things to do than bake our cakes from scratch. So, make a yellow cake mix and bake it in 3 8-inch layers. Remove the cakes from their pans and cool them. I reserve the 2 nicest ones for the top and bottom layers. I cut the less than perfect layer into large cubes, being careful so that they can be reformed into a whole circle. I then set them in a large pan and pour a half a cup of apricot syrup over them. When they have soaked up all the syrup they can, I spread the bottom layer of cake with apricot jam and reform the cubes into the next layer. I spread this with apricot jam and sprinkle it with 2 tablespoonsful of rum. Then we put on the top layer and chill it for at least 2 hours. I glaze the cake with a rum-flavored uncooked fondant. I mix 2 egg whites with 1 2/3 cups of powdered sugar. I add rum, drop by drop, usually about 2 teaspoonsful in all, till the fondant will pour. Then a teaspoonful of vanilla and 1/2 teaspoon of butter flavoring, which help to take the rough edges off this fondant. I then tint it a pretty shade of pink with food coloring. Please choose your food colorings and extracts carefully. Poorly manufactured flavorings quickly lose their intensity, and you're left with a memory instead of a flavor. Now we remove the cake or torte from the refrigerator. I cut strips of wax paper about 4 inches wide and slip them under the edges of the cake so that the serving plate is completely protected. Then I pour on the pink fondant, making sure the whole cake is covered. I let it set at room temperature about an hour, and then I remove the wax paper. Then I cut maraschino cherries into quarters and open them like little flowers and place them on the cake. I blot them completely dry on paper towels first because moisture melts the fondant. Now, this cake should be served with large dollops of sweetened whipped cream flavored with vanilla. And, oh, by the way, this whipped cream can be floated on top of the Viennese coffee, which goes beautifully with the Punsch Torte. I brew a pot of strong black coffee, and then for each serving, I put a dash of cinnamon and a teaspoon of brandy and chocolate syrup in each cup. Fill it with coffee while stirring, and garnish it with a large puff of whipped cream. Drink it through the whipped cream and dream of waltzing in Vienna. Well, we've just completed the joys of a night in old Vienna. We can listen to Strauss waltzes or gypsy violin music in our dreams and scour the memories of the delectable past. Food can tell us so much of the romance and beauty of history, and now we have created our own historical recreation, the foods from the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Guten Appetit, or as the Austrians say, Mahlzeit.